Good evening, everybody. I wanted to welcome you to our presentation tonight. My name is Jennifer Hasser, and I'm going to be talking about struggling readers, when to worry and what to do. This is a basic overview of, for parents and teachers alike who are curious about learning more about what to do for kids who may be struggling and what that looks like. So we are going to get started. But I wanted to let you know that there is going to be a Q&A. You're going to get, this is going to be recorded. It is also going to, we'll pull together the slides for you. So, if anybody, is interested, we will just send out an emi and you can look at them if you like, or, delete it, whatever you choose to do. Hopefully you find it, semi-helpful. You can ask questions during the presentation. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the questions as we go through, but I'll definitely leave time at the end. It's a lot of information, but we'll go through it pretty quickly. So that's why I wanted to let you know that we'll be recording it and also handing out the slides. Okay, and then I'll try to answer questions. The only thing I would ask is that you try to, not make them so overly child specific that, it kind of, it's hard for me to answer. So, I can talk to you at another time if you want to give me a call outside of this, if it's, like a child specific question, but if it's, general, questions that'll be, appropriate for the entire audience. I don't really want to discuss someone's personal child in this format, but general, overarching questions are definitely welcome. All right, so let's get started. Now, I use the term struggling reader because for people who aren't familiar with, the categories of learning disabilities or dyslexia, most people will assume that, a child is a struggling reader, and struggling readers are really going to fall into those same categories depending on the severity. So you might have, a child who's struggling slightly, and then you might have somebody who's really, really having a hard time with it. So there's quite a continuum. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this. So the first thing I want to say is that I am a former classroom teacher. So I started out my career in special education at the high school level, and I worked my way all the way down to kindergarten. So I've had experience with a lot of different grade levels. I'm also a parent of a child with dyslexia, which is, basically a child who struggles to learn how to read. She's now 22, recently graduated from college, very excited about that. But our initial school start was pretty rocky. I founded Syllables Reading Centers. I am also the author of the Kendore curriculum. So I started in the classroom, started working outside the classroom, helping kids, and then started working with teachers. I also started a foundation that was established to fund intervention for public schools. We actually have two scholarships opportunities right now that I wanted to just let people know. We're looking for entire first grade classrooms. We need entire grade level. And so we apply for different grants. And so these are, we have to do the entire grade. So if you're interested in that, you can also reach out to me too, but it has to be a Title I school. And this is just training for teachers in advanced language and really understanding everything there is to know about the language. I'm also the past president of the International Dyslexia Association. So I just want people to know this when I'm talking about this, is that I have been on the public school side. I have been on the private side. I have been a parent, I have been a teacher trainer. I've really honestly been on every single, and I probably should put diagnostician because I did that for a while too. I've been almost, when I say on every side of the table, in an IEP or any type of literacy discussion, I've been there. And so I understand, a lot about the different perspectives, that you have to think about when you're talking about, working with schools and kids and parents and getting them through the process of identifying kids and getting them the help that they need. So I'm happy to answer any questions about any of those things. So the warning signs in the preschool years, the thing about reading issues is that they're highly predictable. You can predict them in preschool with 90% efficiency. So we know what the warning signs look like. We also have assessments that are able to assess them. Why we don't use them earlier, I'm not really sure. A lot of times the schools are set up to find kids later when they fail, and then that makes it harder on the teachers. As a special educator, once a child has already struggled for 3 years, and then they're finally making it to see me, or 6 years or however many years they've been struggling, it would have been much easier if we could have said, oh, here are the prerequisite skills that are required for reading. We notice that you don't have them, and we're going to immediately start doing some intervention. It doesn't mean we have to put you in special ed, but we can do other types of intervention that could head off the need for special education services. And so these are some of the warning signs that are observable, because I think observable signs help people out, right? So you can just tell by looking at them. If you're a parent, if your kids couldn't do common nursery rhymes, if they couldn't finish, cat in the hat, rhymes, or I will not eat it in a boat, I will not eat it with a, and hopefully they say goat or something that rhymes, right? But they put in spoon, then you kind of notice they're not really hearing the difference between, the rhyme that's going on, because reading is an auditory skill, and you're going to need to be able to have these auditory skills like rhyming and being able to do nursery rhymes and finding them entertaining, because you can detect them in order to become a really good reader. So, when you have kids that are having difficulty remembering the names of letters, those mispronouncing words, that's an auditory skill too, because when you learn to speak, you're going to have to hear the sounds and reproduce those sounds. And so it's in the auditory system where you may hear them incorrectly, you interpret them differently, and then so you're going to have possibly speech issues. So having speech issues is one of the first predictors that you're going to have a reading issue. It's kind of the first sign that, okay, my auditory system, hearing these sounds, discriminating the difference, is probably going to cause difficulty when I have to pair those sounds to a symbol. And that's really what phonics is. So there's also, not being able to remember the letters in your name or the names of letters is also linked, because your phonological memory is something that you need to be able to read. And those are predictors that your phonological memory may be poor. So even though we can see these things, what they're telling us is that inside of a child's brain, that these processes are probably struggling. And that is, good information for us to have, so that we can prevent things from happening. We can target some of these areas and kind of firm them up before it becomes a problem, right? So that's always a good idea. The warning signs in kindergarten, failure to understand that words can be broken down into smaller parts. There are lots of kids have trouble with these things where they say elemento and they think it's one thing. But, when they're not recognizing that there are basically pauses in between words, that is another warning sign. The inability to associate the letters with the sounds, connecting that letter B with the B sound, especially with lots of repetition and it's still not sticking. That's an important warning sign, because that's, again, phonological memory and phonological processing, which are going to be those precursors to reading. When we see reading errors that show no connection to the sounds of the letter, when they say, the word big is read as goat, a lot of times kids will guess, or they'll look at the pictures and try to figure out what those words are, but they're not actually using phonics to be able to sound them out, and their word knowledge to be able to do that. Kids will also have sometimes difficulty when they see like the word child and they'll say kids, because they're understanding what that word means, but that can be semantic retrieval, and that's another thing that kind of goes along with it. You might see kids substituting, words like, my daughter said tornado Katrina instead of hurricane Katrina when she was little, because she knew what she was talking about, but she had difficulty retrieving it. And when she was really young, she would say things like, mommy put my window up, but it was already up and she meant down. So sometimes that word retrieval can be a little bit difficult. So if if kids are forgetting words as soon as you talk about it, like if you say this word is was, you don't have to sound that out, just kind of memorize it, and then you turn the page, and on the next page in the next sentence is the word was, and again they go ass, was. That's phonological memory. So that, you know, you just knew it 2 seconds ago, but then it's gone. You have to think of phonological memory as being like the little ticker on the bottom of the news on the TV. Once it's off the screen, it's off the screen. You can't rewind it. You can't go back. You can't try to remember it. And so when that phonological memory is short, you might have told them that word, and then boom, the next second it's gone. And it's a different type of memory than the memory for going to Disney World last year, or, you know, what their favorite hobbies are. It's the kind of memory that is for rote information, like pairing a sound with a symbol. Right? It's like the code. It's not something that's highly interesting, like Disney World, or what what their plans are for the summer. They're probably not going to forget those. Or if you ever told them that you'd buy them a new bike, they're not going to forget that. But they are going to forget common words that you've gone over and over and over again, just by turning the page. The thing about this is, reading problems are genetic, right? So we're getting better at predicting them. So a lot of times, some parents may not even know they had reading problems when they were a child, because it wasn't, they would just say, because when I was a kid, you're like, oh, you're a reading person or you're a math person. And really it was okay if you're a terrible speller, because, people will say at cocktail parties, oh, I'm a terrible speller. But spelling and reading correlates highly, so if you're a poor speller, you're probably not as good of a reader as you could be. So a lot of times people go through life thinking, oh, I'm just a terrible speller and spell check will help it. But they don't read aloud anymore. They're not inside somebody else's brain. So they don't even realize that they are probably running at 30% capacity, and other people are reading twice as fast or way more efficient when it comes to reading and spelling. Because reading, being able to read is not a sign of intelligence, right? You can be extraordinarily smart and have difficulty reading. It has nothing to do with intelligence. You wouldn't say, oh, you're a terrible basketball player. Oh, you must be a terrible reader. There's no correlation. You could be a great reader and a terrible basketball player, and vice versa. And those things have nothing to do with one another. And so it's the same thing with intelligence, right? So you wouldn't say the same. And unfortunately, a lot of what I hear is from kids who are struggling. Even parents will say things to me about their own kids, saying, he seems so smart, but he can't read. And, I kind of joke with them, because I'm like, I'm a terrible dancer. And if somebody saw me dance, I wouldn't want them to go, gosh, I saw her dance. She seems smart, but then I saw her dance. Those things aren't going to correlate. Okay, so we want to keep an eye out for that. If it's not you if you're a parent, if it's not you that has a reading or spelling issue, but maybe a grandparent, if a sibling is struggling, it's highly likely that you're going to have that, issue runs in families, or cousins, or whatever. They may not be able to identify it as a reading disability or dyslexia, but they can say, I'm a terrible speller, or I didn't learn to read till 4th grade. When you start asking older family members, you'll find that tends to be pretty common if a child is struggling. Okay, in the upper grades, that's where you start to see just wild stabs or guesses at words. They just look at the first word and guess. I've had that with my high school kids so many times, and it's going to ruin your comprehension, because you just look at it. I remember the word was consternation, and my students said constipation, and I'm like, that is going to completely change the meaning of that sentence. So we don't want kids to just randomly guess. We want them to be able to figure out what those words are based on phonics and morphology, and looking at the pieces of the words and being able to actually decode them. A lot of times you'll see them omitting small function words. So they get a big word, and you're like, oh, they did get constitution, right? But they missed the, or and, or at. And a lot of times what's happening is they're looking ahead and focusing really hard on what's coming up. So you'll see a lot of omissions of these small words. It doesn't mean that they can't read them. It means that they're probably trying to scan ahead, trying to figure out, what those big words are coming next. And they're smart kids, right? These kids are smart. They can piece a lot of things together, because if they've made it to the upper grades without being identified, they've been able to compensate in some way, right? They have been able to get by with, their intellect, or their, I have a lot of kids who are very good at getting, especially the upper grade kids, getting their girlfriends to do their homework for them, sweet talking the teacher into extra time or extra credit. They have a lot of other strengths, social skills, and intellect to get by, because they really are struggling. You'll see that there's a fear of reading aloud. They try to rely too much on context. Context is a very small part of really how you read. You have to be able to decode the word to figure out even how to use context with it. And the older you get, the less context helps you, because once you're in science and social studies and classes where things are, more complex, you don't have enough vocabulary around the words that you're struggling with in order to be able to use context to figure them out. You use context to figure out, once you've read the word, is it produce or is it produce? Well, in context, I know it's a verb, so it's produce, or I know it's a noun and it's produce. That would be how you would use context, the rest of the words around that word, to figure out how to pronounce that. But it's not going to help you with decoding. Okay. It usually slows kids down. So if you see that they cannot finish their assignments on time, they're spending an inordinate amount of time at homework at night. And sometimes for parents and teachers, the parents don't know how long it should take. So it's taking a very long time. And then the teacher doesn't know how long the child is spending at home, because, it comes back, but they don't realize that it was 5 hours of torment. So if these things are happening, communication between home and school is really important, because as a teacher, I wouldn't want a child to be spending 5 hours doing something that should take them 20 minutes. And as, a parent, I don't want to spend 5 hours helping a child do something that should take 20 minutes. So having those kind of conversations will bring to light what some of the issues are, because especially, there are kids that are just such pleasers, and they want to succeed, and they want their teacher to be proud of them, and they will, really do the extra mile to get things done, and then they don't get identified. So what happens a lot of times is the kids with the behavior issues get identified earlier, because they're like, I'm not doing 5 hours of homework. This is ridiculous. And I can kind of understand that mentality a little bit more, because why would you keep working for years and years and years doing something that is so hard for you? I feel like that would be more my personality, where I'd be like, this is way too hard. I'm not doing it. There's no way somebody could force me to enter bikini contests every day for years. And when I know I would not be good at it, I would definitely become a behavior problem, where they would have to drag me kicking and screaming if they were even suggested or tried to get me to do that, right? So we want to make sure that when we're looking at, kids, their accuracy improves over time, but they continue to lack fluency, because you can be more accurate when you read. You're getting older, you're going to have more exposure, you will look like you're getting better. However, your peers are blowing by you. So we have to make sure that when we're looking at improvement, we're not just looking at improvement of that child, but also compared to those same age peers, right? So yeah, your trajectory is going up, but everybody else's is way up here, and you're still way down here. So we want to make sure that we're using data to help us figure out what is really holding these kids back. But when you start seeing kids with lower self-esteem, and I can't do it, I'm stupid, I don't want to do it, having behavior problems, behavior problems in the classroom are very highly linked to being successful in the classroom. And when we, as teachers, the better equipped we are as teachers to be able to help these kids, the less behavior issues we're going to see in the class. Kids learn very early on, not just in the upper grades, but in the lower grades, that it is better to be bad than stupid in the eyes of their peers. So they would rather, cause a disturbance than read out loud and be ridiculed. So we have to look at, what is causing this type of behavior? Where is this behavior coming from? And why do they hate going to school? Why won't they volunteer for these things? Why won't they, ask to, read aloud when asked? So we want to make sure that we have, not just looking at that behavior in isolation. Behavior does not occur in isolation. I taught behavior disorders. I have a master's degree in behavior. It just doesn't crop up out of nowhere. There's something that's causing it, especially in a classroom setting. Okay. So when we're looking at the cycle of what kind of needs to happen in a school to help these kids, it isn't just one thing. And people want it to be just one thing because that makes life a lot easier. But it is a continuum. And personally, I think it starts with teacher training. And when I started teaching reading, I did not know at all what I was doing. And but I did not know that. I thought, well, I'm a good reader. I can teach kids how to read. But what happens is teachers tend to be more on the natural reader side because they liked schools. They decided to stay in school the rest of their life and teach. And they went to college and they were able to graduate, and then they go into the classroom. And they're not necessarily processing the skill of reading the same way that a kid who struggles to read would. So currently, when you look at our NAEP data, which is our national testing that we do to see if kids are on level for reading, we find that 30% of the population is proficient at reading. Well, if you look at a normal bell curve for virtually any skill, 30% of the population would be natural at basketball, would be natural at dancing. So currently we're teaching the naturals how to read, and we're leaving a lot of other kids behind. So we have to approach the way that we're teaching these kids differently, but we want to make sure that we're meeting the teachers where they are and the students where they are. So with teacher training and good curriculum and instruction and student progress monitoring, teacher accountability and support, then you've got that intervention, because all of these things have to kind of come together. And it's a challenge, and it's a challenge in the schools, the way that there's so much demand for so many different things going on. But it's also, we have to look at accountability as not a negative, because, as teachers, we really need to have that accountability. And as teachers, we want to know we're doing a good job, and we want to be supported in a way that provides growth, not, I guess a lot of this professional development that's just kind of, shoved at us, but never actually supported, never followed through on, and no accountability. Teachers do like accountability. It just, they're not used to it. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to get new things going. But once teachers really have a depth of knowledge, it makes everything in life easier, because teachers got into teaching to help kids. 99% of teachers want to help kids, and they want to do a better job. We lose a lot of our teachers because they are not trained properly, they are not supported, and also honestly held accountable, because, as a teacher, we want our peers to be held accountable too, so that we can be the best that we can be. And accountability really is not a bad thing. So when we're talking about what needs to go into a reading program, it is supposed to have all of these components. So it should be phonetic, analytic, structured, sequential, and I'll talk to you about what these things mean. Repetitive, cognitive, multisensory. So that means, we can hear it, we can feel it, we can discuss it and explain it. All these different things that are going to help us to anchor it instead of just, rote memorization. A lot of, reading programs out there and spelling, it's rule of the week, and then that's it. So you go on to the next rule of the week and the next rule of the week. And as a parent, if any of you are parents out there, I doubt you had rule of the week at home where you said, okay, this is elbows off the table week, and you had to do it for 1 week and you never had to say it again. You probably had to say it over and over and over again. You probably started with clean your room week and then realized you had to do clean your room week for 10 straight years. And then, because if it's important, it should be repeated, and it should be, that's why it should be structured and sequential and analytic, and you want kids to truly understand it with a depth and not just regurgitating information. So that's why, you know, these components are set up, because when we go through the structure of language, you know, a lot of times when you get to like middle schools, vocabulary is just this list of words where you memorize them, you spell them on Friday, use them in a sentence, and then all of a sudden those words are supposed to enter your vocabulary. But if you're really explaining what words mean, you can take a part of a word and have it applied to hundreds of other words, which is way more efficient, and you're going to see that the benefits really grow exponentially. So if I were to say teach, you know, SCI, which means to know. If you have science class, ENCE is a suffix that makes that a noun. So science is really to know class. So when you see SCI anywhere, it's going to have something to do with knowing. So if you're conscious and you see SCI in there, it means with knowing, you know, so I'm conscious. And OUS is going to be an adjective, so it's describing my state. If I were hit in the head by a meteor and then all of a sudden I'm unconscious, it means I'm not with knowing. But if I have a conscience or conscientious or any word that has SCI in it, it's going to have to do with to know. So when we can take something like that and talk about, you know, because people all the time are like, oh, SC, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen the memes, you know, is which one's the silent letter, you know, the S or the C? I'm like, neither, because if we don't have the SC together, we don't know that it means to know, because, you know, that is part of the meaning, and that's part of the morpheme. So we can help kids who are having memory difficulties by giving them things to really anchor to. Phonological memory, in general, majority of kids with any type of learning issue have a memory deficit. And there are, like I said, 50 different types of memory, but it is very common because we have this, you know, unequal performance in kids that, you know, have difficulties with reading, but may not have them in math, you know, may have good listening comprehension, but still can't hold on to the decoding piece. So what is it that's keeping them from being able to do that? You know, I joke with my kids with dyslexia. I'm like, well, I have dysdansia. And what is keeping me from being a good dancer? I'm pretty sure it's rhythm, coordination, you know, a bunch of other things. But those are prerequisites, and those prerequisite skills, we have to target those, talk about those, make sure that kids are aware of those deficits, and build them back up so that they may need extra repetition, they're going to need extra intervention, and that's okay, right? We just need to know it in advance so that they don't develop, you know, behaviors and bad habits and guessing. And because when you have to fix all of that, it's going to take a lot more time away from the school. So, you know, the interventions can be done in a way that maximizes instruction and brings kids up, but also makes life easier for teachers. So I'm very much into, as a teacher, making my life easier and spending more of my time on instruction and the kids enjoying learning than dealing with behaviors and kids struggling to succeed. And I think, you know, most teachers would agree that that would be their preference. Phonological awareness is a big predictor because it is your auditory system, right? So if kids can't do word segmentation, if they can't recognize rhyme and they can't produce rhymes, if they have trouble, phonemes are your smallest, smallest sound in the language. So if I had cat, the sounds in cat would be k, at. So I would have 3 phonemes, and kids need to be able to pull those apart. So if you're in kindergarten, that's going to be a big focus. If you're in middle school and you're still really struggling for reading, you have to go back, but you can't go back in a way that's going to make them feel like a kindergartner, or you're going to get behaviors. But you still need to understand where the root of the problem is coming from. You know, I use analogies all the time, but if you're building a house and, you know, you're fine on the first floor, the second floor, third floor, but now the weight of the house, we realized the foundation wasn't strong enough. You can't keep going up. You're going to have to go down and fix that foundation before you're going to be able to keep putting more stories on that house. So we can't think of phonological awareness as a kindergarten skill. We have to think about it as a prerequisite skill. So if we want to meet our struggling kids where they are, we can build phoneme awareness in at a level that won't make them feel you know, that they're back in kindergarten. And so there's lots of ways to do that, but phoneme manipulation, which is cat to hat, is going to lead to morphological awareness, which is taking a word like unicorn and recognizing that corn is the same part as cornucopia, because cornucopia is horn of plenty and unicorn is one horn. So if kids can pull sounds apart, then they can pull parts of words apart and recognize that there's meaning there. So a unicorn has one horn and a cornucopia is a horn of plenty. So corn means horn. And that can start to roll into when they say, okay, well, unicorn, one horn, cornucopia, you know, horn of plenty, copious amounts of food at a banquet, oh, plentiful. And they take words and it starts to snowball because they're seeing that these words are all connected. Oral language is a really big thing, because if kids are young and they lack exposure, then we know that some kids are entering school with millions of words spoken to them, and kids who are at 3 million word deficits, right? So how do we make these gains with kids that have lacked that exposure? You're going to have to attack words in a way that gives you more than one word at a time. And that's why, you know, when I'm talking about doing SCI, or, you know, talking about unicorn to cornucopia, these are things that even in oral language, you can expand a student's vocabulary in a more efficient way. Right? Phonics is basically just the sound symbol correspondence. If you have the sound B and then the letter B, that's what phonics is. So phonics is just the code. And so the code is very important, but the code is not the end all be all, because I could have the word phonics, for example, I could pronounce it phonics. How do I know it's phonics? You know, without knowing that ick is a suffix and phon is the root that means sound, then I could pronounce it more than one way. So you have to integrate morphology and you have to integrate grammar. So typically schools are doing this thing where they go, we have spelling for 10 minutes, then we have grammar for 10 minutes, we have our reading time for 10 minutes, then we have our word work for 10 minutes, and it's just this crazy schedule. Whereas we should be looking at all of these things in a combination, because to spell phonics, we now know phon means sound, ick is a suffix that is the characteristic of, so phonics is the characteristic of having that sound, and then the S makes it plural. So if we have all of these things, you know, combined, then we're being more efficient. We can move kids faster. We can give them better base skills, and they have to, you know, rely on guessing less, because they're going to have all these tools to be able to say, okay, if I see a PH, I know that there's a root somewhere. You will never see a PH that is not in a Greek root, because it's going to be in, you know, PHON, or in graph, it's going to be at the end, but it's still going to be in a root, because those words came from Greek. 50 to 60% of our language is Latin. Then we have next there's Greek, and then French, and we have Anglo-Saxon. And Anglo-Saxon tends to be our, you know, words that we learn in K through 2. You know, usually the more irregular words, but like was and should and could, a lot of our function words. But once you start getting into the upper grades, you really need to understand Latin and Greek, because those are the those words are the words of learning. That's where you're going to have science words, and you're going to have words like instructor being Latin, teach being Anglo-Saxon. So we typically have, this, lower level word tends to be more Anglo-Saxon, lower grades. And then, instructor would be more of an upper grade word, but that's where the true academic language comes in. And so kids are going to need to have that integrated grammar and morphology and knowing what suffixes mean and making it a little bit more rule-based so that it makes more sense and it's not just lists of words. It makes a big difference for kids that struggle, but it also makes a huge difference for kids that aren't struggling, because the kids that aren't struggling will benefit as well, because how can you not benefit from learning a little bit more about our language? And it frees up that, working memory space, because everybody has like a memory hard drive. They're born with great memories or average memories, or, we might as well maximize our storage. So just like you do on your iPhone, right? You run out of pictures, now you gotta decide which kid do I like more. I gotta delete something, or maybe I'll delete the price tags from IKEA or something, weird things I took pictures of. But you're forced to make choices when you don't have as much storage space in your head. And so that's why we see a lot of kids end up guessing. Fluency is also really important because accuracy is important, but you have to read fast enough to be able to comprehend. If you've ever listened to a struggling reader that is so slow, where they're like the, at, cat, saw, by the time they get to the end of the sentence, they've forgotten the beginning of the sentence. Right? We need to read at a speed that is going to allow us to comprehend what we're reading. So some kids may be accurate, they're not fast enough to do the true comprehending, because while you're comprehending, you have to be able to create images in your mind to be able to remember the stories. You have to have enough space because you're efficient enough to be able to retrieve all these things. So while we're doing that, we should be making sure our sounds are accurate. That's what sound drills are. Discovery words, those are those non-phonetic words. Most of them have rules that govern them. English is not crazy, but as we move through, sometimes there'll be some words that we just introduce because we need them at the time and we don't have time to delve into the reasons behind them because they may not be as frequent, but I call those discovery words. Nonsense words help us as teachers to figure out, where are they struggling and what do we need, to work on? What can't they apply? And with nonsense words, we know they're not real words, so we're able to see what strategies that they're able to use when they come across an unknown word. Phrase drills help with prosody so that they can read with rhythm and not sound like a robot. And controlled vocabulary makes them successful. So in a controlled vocabulary story, you're only putting on the page what they've learned. That way, as they're learning, they can, oops, I went backwards. As they're learning the new skills, it's going to keep progressing. All right, so in vocabulary, I talked a little bit about this already, but the schools can make tiered word lists so that you're giving them the words that they really need and the words that are at the level that they can be successful. If you can make vocabulary student driven, where the students have some input into the way that they're learning vocabulary, they have a way of going in and researching the words and figuring out maybe origin or the stories behind them, because they find those stories pretty interesting. And then they can work on multiple meanings, because a lot of times in the younger grades, we'll teach words that are, easily decodable, and you have, book. Well, book could have a lot of different definitions, and it could be a noun, it could be a verb, because multiple meanings as a verb, multiple meanings as a noun. We need to make sure that we are exposing kids to those possibilities so that when they say, his dad would not let the kid live in the house, we might go, wait a second, that's not very nice. Oh, they live on a farm. Maybe it's a goat. That's what a kid is, a baby goat. And that's going to help their comprehension, and it's going to make more sense in context of that story. And so multiple meanings in smaller words are more common. So, the shorter a word is, the more meanings it has. The longer a word is, the more likely it's Latin or Greek, and you can decode it by its pieces because you're going to have prefixes and root and suffixes, and it's going to be easier to figure out. A lot of those Anglo-Saxon words that have so many different meanings can prove a little more challenging, but they're also highly frequent in the lower grades. Right? Handwriting, especially for young kids, sound formation, spacing, proper paper placement, proper pencil grip, that it follows a scope and sequence, because you want to make sure that they've got good habits, because the habits are going to matter, right? So if your paper is placed straight up and down, and you have like your hand in a hook, you're gonna, by the time if you're in third grade, you're gonna be shaking your hand because it hurts so much, because it's going to tense all your muscles going all the way up to your neck. So it definitely is something that is more important than people think. People are like, you can use technology, you can type, but we know that handwriting actually produces better sentences. So there was a study that people wrote thousands of sentences. Some were handwritten, some were typed. They ended up typing them all up, sent them to English teachers, and had them grade them. And the ones that were originally handwritten were of better quality. So that, handwriting seems to still matter. It's been kind of wired in our brain for a long time. So we need to make sure that we are getting, kids the practice they need with handwriting. And if they can't finish their assignments, that's also going to be an issue. Okay, so identification and assessment. In kindergarten, the strongest reading predictors are phonological awareness, which I went over, phonological memory, which is that short-term auditory memory, and rapid automatic naming, which is your ability to retrieve information quickly and accurately. So these, and on this page, are typically what we would see in a kindergarten assessment. Receptive vocabulary will give you an idea of how much exposure that child has had to language. And word identification, can they read real words or nonsense words? So difference between exposure and instruction. And if we can look at those predictors, because even at the beginning of kindergarten, it's rare that kids will really be true readers. A lot of them have memorized some sight words, but you can predict how quickly they're going to learn to read by testing, phonological awareness, phonological memory, and rapid automatic naming. When you have kids in middle school, you can figure out why they're not succeeding by testing those things. So figure out what has caused this problem. We know you're not reading. We know you're struggling. We know your spelling is not good, but what caused it? And sometimes, depending on the, severity of it, these things can be fixed really quickly. And because they've made it that far without any type of diagnosis, without being referred, there's probably areas of strengths that could help compensate if they can really get those, tests, done, and then the proper interventions. Okay, so I've got a couple questions on here that I'm going to talk about, or answer now, but the phonological memory assessments, I use the CTOP, which is the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, and teachers can use that if they want to. There are also free measures that you can get online, and there are also free screeners that you can get online that give you a really good idea, and you can use them to decide, maybe which kids really are low and might need, an additional longer measure. But phonological memory is basically, like, an example would be if I just asked a child to repeat after me. If I said 7, 6, 2, if they can go 7, 6, 2, then they can hold 3 units in their short-term working memory. So then I might make it longer, like 8, 3. You don't want to sing-song it, because then they'll repeat it with a rhythm, and that helps them to hold on to it. But you could easily say, 7, 2, 4, 9, 3. If they can't repeat back a string of digits that are 3 or 4, numbers long, they're going to have a very hard time blending a word. So if you see a kid who goes b, at, and then goes butterfly, which I see all the time. There's probably a phonological memory deficit, right? They've learned to pair the sound and the symbol, but they can't blend it. You'll also see kids who go b at and then go tab and read it backwards. And that is oftentimes because of the same reason, that they can't hold it long enough to blend it back together, that they go back and have to remind themselves of what they just read. Okay. So someone's asking me what I think about letter formation. So a lot of kids make their letters from the bottom up. If you're taught properly and you go from the top down, it's going to be a lot easier to, teach them cursive, and cursive is much easier than print. And so the letters are easier to form because you've got a flow that is uninterrupted. You don't have to pick your pencil up and put it back down and pick it up and put it down. It's also B's and D's are formed completely differently. A lot of those commonly confused letters are actually easier to learn in cursive, but yeah, so it is much easier. It's going to slow kids down if they write from the bottom up. It makes it much faster if they go from the top down when they're learning print. Okay, so these are my thoughts on kind of intervention. Is, if you are going in, and this is for asking teachers, and asking the school if you're a parent, but also as the teacher, sometimes schools will say, oh my gosh, all these questions are hard. I don't want parents coming and asking me that. But I as a teacher, I don't have any problem with anybody asking me these questions, right? If you're a professional and you're trained and you're teaching reading, you should very easily be able to answer all of these questions. I have run interventions at schools for 20 years. I actually just finished a contract I had with a school for 10 years. And I did all the intervention groups, and I was, the teacher, and parents would ask me questions like this all the time. And if they didn't, I would tell them anyway. What program are we using? I can tell you if teachers are like, well, we don't really have a program, or we don't know what we're, you should know your scope and sequence. I mean, if you think about this, like saying, oh, where are you going on vacation? Oh, I don't really know, how much time do you have for vacation? Well, we're not really sure. I mean, that's not what you would, how would you know you're halfway through your vacation? Oh, well, we'll just see. That's just not the way life works. All of these things are very reasonable. You would say, how long are you going on vacation for? 2 weeks. How are you getting there? Oh, we're driving to California. How are you going to know when you're halfway? What's your halfway point? All of these things you will have planned out. Well, maybe you don't get to California because you run out of time and you got a flat tire. That would be, what are we going to do if they're not progressing? Those types of things are exactly what you would think of, on a vacation. Like sometimes on a vacation, you're going to have to say, oh, I've got to choose. We got a flat tire in St. Louis. So now we're running out of time. I have to choose between a giant ball of yarn and the Grand Canyon. and you have to make that decision. You might say, oh, I'm going to go to the Grand Canyon because it's supposedly amazing. Or you might say, well, I can go to the Grand Canyon another time. It's been there a million years and this giant ball of yarn might disappear. So as a teacher, you have to make choices sometimes about how much you're going to be able to get through, but you should know where you're starting and you should know your destination. And if you only got to St. Louis, then next year you'd pick up from St. Louis and you'd have to make it to California. And it might be slower than you wanted, but you at least know that you're going in a direct, systematic way, and following progress. So that's how goals should be written as well, right? If you said, oh, my goal was to get to California, and then, did you reach your goal? No, so I'll just make a goal for next year. But you need a more detailed plan. What are my dates? How am I getting there? Am I driving? Am I flying? Am I taking a bus? So all of these things should be things that are thought out, by the school. So it's really not insulting and it shouldn't be challenging at all. When I'm doing intervention, if they said, do you do phonological awareness? Yes. If they ask me what is an example of phonological awareness activity, I would be able to give them 10 examples or more. So because I can explain what I do, and I don't think that's a big deal to share it, and I don't think it's a problem for parents to ask. And I know that sometimes people don't like that, but I think professionals should be okay with it, right? So has the teacher been trained and in reading? I was put in a situation where I was not trained when I was first put in the classroom at all. I should not have been there. And, so I don't think it's wrong to ask, are you trained? Do you know how to teach reading? Do you know how many sounds are in our language? It's not a bad thing. What is the intensity, duration, and frequency? So that just means how often am I seeing you, right? And for how long? And what are we thinking about, time frame? So we want to know those questions. That's fine. That you should be able to answer that. You're going to have a schedule. You're going to have to know. And then how will the pace of instruction be determined? Am I just going to keep going even though you don't know it? Or am I going to be doing benchmark testing? Am I going to, what criteria am I using for mastery? And will I be informed about, my child's progress? I think all of these are very, very reasonable questions to ask an education professional. Okay. Okay. Someone's asking me how to determine a student has a reading disability or difficulty with visual processing. And then it says colored overlays. I am not a believer in colored overlays. I know some people are. I think there's not research to support it. But we do know that if you have a vision problem, that is a problem. You need to get glasses, you need to have your vision checked. We don't want you to have a reading issue just because you can't see. If kids think color overlays work for them, I am fine with that. I use those little easy reader strips where there's like a little window on it and it can be pink or blue or yellow, and I let the kids pick. I'm totally fine with that. But those cost $1. And the people who try to sell you overlays, oftentimes they're selling you an overhead projector, like screen colored sheet for $80. I don't know. I'm just not a huge fan. So if you have full psychological report, you're going to have a lot more information, but you don't necessarily need one to get started. I'm not talking about, when I'm saying intervention, this doesn't have to be special ed. This can be kindergarten. This can be, we're going to, go in and do some extra 30 minutes a day to prevent you from struggling in the future. So, obviously once you're already into the special ed process, you're going to have, a full IEP, and then these questions would automatically be answered and covered in that IEP. Okay. All right. So this, I think, is a big part of it because a lot of our teachers are asked to do things that they're not trained in. And I have experienced that. But so when we talk about teacher accountability and support, I think, our administrators need to be trained. And the reason they need to be trained is they need to understand how to support the teachers. They need to understand what needs to go into the curriculum, how much time it's going to take. That instructional support should be built into that master schedule. Time and finances should be put in to support that. To me, if you don't leave school being able to read, that is a very big problem, and reading, I kind of joke that as a teacher, I said, well, my first priority is keep them alive. My second priority is to teach them to read. And I think, most teachers would say that was the number one goal of getting out of school is to be able to have that skill. So it is going to require time and effort and resources, and it should be made a priority. Teachers should be supported, with certified mentors and modeling, because, if you're a teacher in a classroom, it is a very isolated job. You don't get to observe lots of other teachers. You don't get really lots of observations. And when you are observed, it's a couple times a year. And, administrators are overworked, honestly, in my opinion, overworked and underpaid. And how are they going to provide that type of level of support for a teacher? But if they're trained and they can find the people to give that support, I think that is really important. Teachers value having that support. Of course, sometimes they complain a little because as a teacher, we tend to complain a little, but I think that's just kind of the nature. Until a teacher becomes an administrator, they don't regret complaining, and a lot of teachers just never become administrators. So it's kind of one of the kind of hazards of being an administrator. You're not appreciated a lot of times from below or above. So it's a tough job. The data discussions, I see a lot of data-driven discussions where nobody really understands the data, what that data is saying to them and where it's coming, and support for differentiation. We, need to make sure we're teaching the teachers truly how to understand the data that they're seeing. Okay, this is my opinion about this. I mean, we have a lot of, things we can do better in schools, right? We have a lot of things we could do better as parents. I mean, pretty much we all have a lot of things we could do better. And so I look at it as, if we focus on these problems and we complain incessantly about these problems, I feel like we're going to have more problems. But when we talk about the possibilities, I feel like we'll have more opportunities. So to me, it is really important that we think about how can we make these changes for kids without, upending everything. It can be a slow, steady pace towards improvement, but teachers have got to learn the science of reading. They have to understand what goes into reading. They have to understand that it's not a choice to be a good reader or a poor reader. You are born a good natural reader or a poor reader, and the teacher is what is going to make the difference. So I oftentimes love getting the class where the kids are low, because when they're low, I can show amazing improvement. If all my kids are in the 99th percentile, how am I going to, show really great improvement? I mean, I can definitely teach them a lot, but I love taking those kids that are in the 30th percentile and getting them to the 75th. I mean, that's life changing. And when teachers experience that, they enjoy it too. So, giving them the tools to be able to do that, I think, is the greatest gift that you can give the kids, the teachers, and the parents. It makes everybody's life a lot easier. Okay, so let me look at some of the questions. We're kind of done with the presentation. When is it appropriate for a child? Oh, repeating grades. Okay, I am not a fan of repeating grades. The only time that I really have recommended a child repeat a grade was in kindergarten, when there's not, the emotional maturity is not there. They need another year to develop, maybe the social skills or the ability to function in the classroom, or they can't hold enough in their short-term working memory to follow basic directions. Though that is pretty much the only time I've recommended retention, because if you are not meeting a child where they are for their deficits, it doesn't matter if you retain them and do the same thing again, because if a child is struggling and their prerequisite skill needs aren't being met, they might look like they do better the second year because they're doing it again. But the next year, they're going to start to slowly fall behind again. And they can't repeat every other grade for 2 years. You're going to have to go in and target the deficit area and shore that up so that they can move along and progress. There's over 200 different studies that prove that retention does not work. And the National Association of School Psychologists doesn't recommend it. So it's really tends to be, kind of a last ditch recommendation when people don't know what else to do. They say, oh, another year would help them. But another year of the same dance lessons isn't going to make me a better dancer. It's going to have to be more specific, more targeted, more broken down, more repetitive. And that's really what is going to happen with kids. Okay. Okay, how do I communicate some of this with my school? So if you're going into a school and you're a parent, parents have valuable information about their kid, and teachers need to listen, but also parents need to be nice. And I see sometimes there's a little bit of hostility there. Now, going in and starting a conversation, when I'm at an IEP, if I'm representing parents, I'm going to say the same recommendations as if I were representing the school, because there's only so many hours in the day. there's only so many things a classroom teacher can do when they have 25 other students. So you have to be reasonable, and you have to look at what things can we do that's going to make the maximum impact. But my daughter was on IEP her entire school career. I got in one disagreement, and that was not until 11th grade, because I had a coach who didn't really want to do anything. But I'll say that again to his face. We had a slight disagreement, but the point being is that of all the teachers I worked with, and I personally trained 10,000 teachers. Okay, so I know teachers are good at heart. I know they want to do a good job. I know they want to be successful. I know they want their students to be successful, and so I think they need to be treated with respect. But I do know also that a lot of times in the school system, it's not set up to meet the needs of some kids, and sometimes you need to bring in resources that are going to be able to help your teachers get to a point where they can really help those kids, or rearrange the schedule, or be willing to try something new. So I like it when parents and teachers collaborate. I think that's when you get the best of both worlds. But there are exceptions to everything. Sometimes people won't listen, and sometimes things have to happen. But to me, sitting down and just having a discussion is the best idea. Okay, so let's see. Am I a proponent of computer programs that help kids with dyslexia? I really don't love them, but sometimes they can supplement. There are some that are pretty good for supplementary, but it is an auditory task. There needs to be somebody helping a kid to understand whether they're hearing the sounds correctly, whether they can reproduce the sounds correctly. If they can write. There's a lot of clicking going on with the computer. There's not a lot of oral reading. There's no one listening to see where your errors are, and not a lot of diagnostics. So, if there's, something where it's some reading practice or some reading games, and it's, 15, 30 minutes a day, and it's kind of done so the teacher can have centers and different things going on in a large group, then I don't have any problem with that. I just don't think it should be a substitute for a well-trained teacher. So that is my opinion on that. Okay, so a child on the autism spectrum with speech delays can read words but struggles with comprehension. That is a tough one. It's a tough one because kids with autism tend to be pretty good with codes. They like codes, they like predictability. And phonics is a code, and it's very predictable. They tend to be pretty good readers. And from that regard, I mean, decoding, they can decode the words, they can read the words. Comprehension is a problem. And the reason it is because the comprehension is not predictable. Even though you have only 44 sounds in our language, and 26 letters, they can be arranged in so many different ways that are going to impact comprehension. And comprehension it's two-dimensional. It's on a piece of paper. Kids with autism have difficulty with comprehension when there's like facial expressions and hands waving and all of that. So it is honestly a natural continuum of the nature of autism to have reading comprehension difficulties. So it is a very difficult thing to work on. So, but a lot of times what I've done with my kids that are on the spectrum is I'll take things like idioms and teach them as if they are, kind of phrases with definitions. Instead of, don't cry over spilt milk being literal, I'll say, well, this is what it really means, to try to help bridge some of those language gaps that aren't naturally going to fill in because of the nature of autism. But it is very, very common that you would see, it's almost, the same thing, chicken or the egg. Oral language comprehension, written comprehension, they're just a different side of the same coin. So it is more difficult. Okay, is there an online program? Yeah, people are asking a lot about online. I don't do a lot of online, so I'm probably not your best person to really recommend anything for online. But I know there are a couple good ones, out there that would be good to help in between or supplement. Okay. What is the difference between a reading disability and dyslexia? Not much. So a reading disability is a difficulty learning to read, and there's a reading comprehension and there's reading decoding, and those are the two different umbrellas of the reading. So a lot of times in schools, you'll just be diagnosed with a specific learning disability, and then they'll say with a deficit in reading. But the dyslexia is virtually the same thing. So if you have a decoding issue, reading decoding disability, it's synonymous with dyslexia. Dyslexia is actually in the definition in the DSM definition. It's just right underneath the title of reading disabilities. So they are the same thing. A lot of times people think dyslexia is a medical diagnosis because the process happens in your brain. But I hate to break it to you, but virtually every process happens in your brain, because if you happen to lose your head, you'd have a hard time learning anything. So it's really not diagnosed by medical professionals, it's diagnosed by educational professionals. So dyslexia is just, it's become a little bit of a stumbling block with people not wanting to use the term. But that's why in the presentation I said, don't get hung up on it. Just because they're not using the term dyslexia, and they're just using reading disability, you can still move forward with that diagnosis. I think we're gaining more of an understanding in the nation and in the state here about what dyslexia is, and people are realizing it's demystifying it to be, it's just a difficulty with reading based on a phonological processing deficit. And most of our kids who struggle to read have it. That's what they have. But if you think about it on a continuum, if you have a random group of 100 people and you say, of those 100 people, how many people do you think are going to be bad at basketball? You'd probably say 25%, right? Because 25% would be pretty good. You've got like 50% in the middle. That'd be, average, but with some good instruction. And then you've got 25% over here where you're like, I think you should take up chess, right? So it makes sense that if you said any sport on the planet, ballet or knitting or anything, out of 100 people, how many people are going to be poor at this? You'd probably say about 20%. So why is reading any different, right? It's going to be difficult for about 25% of the population. So basically what the numbers are, they say, is like 1 in 5, right? And so that's about 20%. But if you think about it, that's what's going to happen, because that kind of makes sense, because reading is a man-made skill. It is not something, you don't have a reading part of your brain. You're going to have to learn how to read using other parts of your brain. There's no basketball part of your brain. There's no ballet part of your brain, right? You use other parts to be able to execute those man-made skills. So learning to speak is going to happen for the majority of the population. A natural true disability rate is only like 2% of the population. People who can't speak or can't hear or can't see or can't walk without anything happening to them, just a natural occurrence, it's going to be very small, right? But if you're talking about a man-made skill like reading or any sport, or you're going to have a continuum of people who don't have the prerequisite skills necessary for it. So it's not unusual that not everybody is going to be put on a basketball court with a coach and perform well. Not every student is going to be put in a classroom with other kids and a teacher and perform well. We have to figure out what's causing them to not perform and work on it. The same way a good basketball coach would take a kid that's not great and move them to the middle. Okay, well, you can be the best kid in your neighborhood, or you can be the best kid in your high school, or you can make it to college, but you're not going to make it to MBA. And then these kids over here are in the NBA. But with reading, we need it for life. So we need to move those kids. We don't need basketball to succeed in life, but we do need to be able to read and to be, at minimum functionally literate. So we need to move all kids along the continuum. And that's what makes it harder for us, as teachers, to take every kid. We don't expect every basketball coach to take every kid and move them, right? They get to cut kids from their team. And as teachers, we don't get to cut anybody. We have to say, how do we meet their needs? And that is something that still the schools are struggling with, still teachers are struggling with, to do better at meeting everyone's needs. But it is a process, and I think we're moving closer every day. And I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for asking questions. And if you want to reach out to me, feel free. My email is jennifer.hasser@kendorelearning.com. And it was a pleasure. Have a good night.